Yeah, it's time for the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast, everybody. Thank you so much for pressing play. And thank you so much for subscribing, especially those of you now subscribing on Patreon, which is where you can pay for a subscription for pennies a month, dollars a month, whatever you want to pay. There's a bunch of different tiers. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. I am overwhelmed, inspired, and very excited that so many of you have subscribed. I sent out the email blast on Friday, and the reaction has been amazing. We're going to need a lot more, but we've just gotten started. We're going to add more episodes and special features, and I'd love to hear from you. So email me, standupwithPeteDominic. StandupwithPete@gmail.com is my email. And tell me who you want to hear on the show, because we're going to have so many amazing guests joining us for this conversation every single week. Some episodes will have 2 or 3 guests. Some episodes will be a really long conversation with one guest, and you never know who's going to join us. So let me know who you'd like for me to get on the show. And speaking of shows, I am going to be in Syracuse this weekend. If you're listening on, what day is it? Monday, the 25th, Thanksgiving week. I'm headlining the Syracuse Funny Bone in my hometown of Syracuse, New York, taping a special, my first big 1-hour special in a long time. Well, I did an album a few years ago, but this is a video, a special, and I need you to come out if you're in or around Syracuse, where I grew up, Saturday night at the Funny Bone. Check it out. All right, my conversation today is with Tim Wise, who is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the entire country. He spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in every state in this country, at high school and college campuses. He's written a whole bunch of books. He has his own new podcast. And check out speakoutnow.org for the always brilliant, always inspiring Tim Wise. So glad to have had him join me. We had a really thoughtful, wide-ranging conversation that was inspiring as hell, and I really hope that you love it as much as I do. Here we go. Tim, thank you very much for doing the podcast. You know, you've always been one of my favorite guests to talk to.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to keep that conversation going. I'm also real excited about your own podcast, too. Speak Out with Tim Wise. If you're listening to this, we'll talk about that. But in case people don't know who you are, I wanted to do a little introduction. And so I went back and went into, I don't know if this is accurate, but Wikipedia in terms of your history and your kind of origin story. And I thought it would be interesting to just get a little of that, because I was thinking, how did Tim Wise become who he is? And of course, you grew up in Louisiana, and you worked for a couple of really interesting organizations at a young age. But what was it that brought you to the work that you've been doing now for over 30 years?
Right. Well, first I should say I actually grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, but I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. So some of the origin story stuff certainly has to do with my time in New Orleans at Tulane University and working as an activist there in the city of New Orleans. And after I graduated, working against David Duke, former Klansman, lifelong white supremacist, modern Nazi, when he ran for the U.S. Senate and for governor in 1990 and 91. But really, I mean, the origins do go back before that. You know, growing up, really a child of the 70s, let's say. I was born in 1968 to parents here in Nashville who were, they were young. They were very, civil rights oriented parents. They were not activists. They were a little too young to have been actively involved in the movement. But they raised me a certain way with a certain sensibility, sent me to a preschool where I was one of the few white kids in the preschool. I went to a historically black college for early childhood education preschool when I was, 4 years old. And so, being sort of in a context where I wasn't always the norm, I think was a really interesting sort of foundational experience for me. Also, having black authority figures, the women that ran that preschool program were African-American women. So I'm learning at the age of 4, let's say, to really respect black authority in ways that I think most white kids in 1972 would not have been, and probably even most white kids today and white adults today never have to. And so in a sense, I think there was this sort of foundational connection to issues of race experience, even just by experiential learning, right, that a lot of times white Americans don't have. And so I had an awareness so that when I got to elementary school in integrated public schools in Nashville, which had really only been integrated really for a couple of years by the time I started, where my peer network are mostly black kids. That's who I know. That's who I hang out with because it's who I went to preschool with. So it's sort of who I'm comfortable around. And so when I see them being treated differently by teachers, being tracked into lower level classes or being punished more harshly, even though I'm breaking all the same rules and doing all the same stupid shit that all kids do, you start to notice that when those are your friends. The other white kids, you're probably not going to notice it because to them, being on one side of the room and the black kids on the other side of the room, that's just like their neighborhood. It's like what they're used to, right? But for me, having been at Tennessee State University for preschool, that was a little weird. And so I'm filing things away, in the back of my head, even at 6 years old. It's not like I ran home the first week of school and was like, Mom, you are not going to believe the institutional white supremacy at Burton School. Holy hell, it's terrible. But there, you just sort of remember things. There's things that stick with you. And so all throughout my early childhood and really all the way through school, I just kept noticing there were just things that would stand out to me about the institutional differences in the way that I was being treated versus the way that my very close friends were. And by the time I got to New Orleans and was at Tulane, it was very obvious because I was in a really white school in a black city, and so the contrast had been more stark.
You're talking there, of course, it all makes a lot of sense. You don't have to be a scholar to understand that when you grow up with more diversity, when you grow up as you did at the most indelible ages, they say universal pre-K is the most important time for a child's education, and you were there and you had these black women who are, as you said, authoritarian figures. They were the leaders, they were the teachers, they were in control. That makes a huge difference, but it made me think about when I worked in New York City as a personal trainer and just living in the Upper West Side. I worked as a lacrosse coach at the most prestigious private school in Manhattan. And a lot of those white kids that lived in that neighborhood and went to that school had nannies who were black or from the islands. So I wonder, those kids who grew up with those nannies, very rich families, that they had live-in help, basically. Yeah. Some of them did live there, but they were there almost every day. They often had very good relationships with those nannies. And Peter Coyote, the actor and Buddhist, and like he's a good friend of mine. He tells a story in his book about that being the main reason why he did not grow up racist, because his nanny was basically like his mother to him because he didn't really have, his mother wasn't present. So is there any research on that idea? Because we're talking about having exposure to diversity makes you understand, how the world works to some extent and that people are equal and we're humans. But is there any research on that idea that even if you grew up in a very rich area with very little diversity, but you have exposure, intimate exposure to a person of color or of a different ethnicity than your own, that makes it different? Yeah.
Well, I don't know. And here's the thing about the nanny example that can be a bit dicey. Like, I'm sure for Peter, that's no doubt true. And I would imagine for a lot of other folks it is. Of course, in the South, where I'm from, lots of white kids had black nannies and housekeepers in wealthy families, and even not so wealthy families. Even a lot of middle class families in the sort of mid 20th century South had black women working in their homes. And I wouldn't say that it necessarily inoculated them against racism. It's obviously the sum total of all your experiences. And so I think probably growing up in a place like New York or a place that's a bit more cosmopolitan, the combination of that and the proximity probably matters. Whereas elsewhere, the benefits of that can be overwhelmed. Having said that, look, I coming from the South, I can certainly say, and I think about this a lot, that the proximity with which white folks in the South and black folks in the South grow up, the closeness, I'm talking physical closeness, even under segregation, white and black folks were bumping into each other all the time in the South, much more so than in more segregated parts of the country. I do think there is a familiarity that often leads to a personal closeness that sometimes, unfortunately, is not enough to overcome the institutional distance and the institutional inequality. And so you had a lot of white folks, for instance, in the South that had good, warm, personal relationships with other black folks, but they were, it wasn't enough to want them to actually have equal rights. You know what I mean? There were a lot of white, for me, like my mom's mom was someone who was not a vicious racist by any stretch, but who certainly didn't have a problem with segregation and just couldn't figure out what all the fuss was about, but she would have always been nice to black people. You know what I mean? So I think there's it's very much a mixed bag. I think for me, what made the difference wasn't just that I was around black folks, but that I was at a black institution where those black women, it wasn't just that they were around. It's like they could put my ass out of the class if I acted up. They had the final say. They had the power. It was in North Nashville. It was on a black campus at a black college in a black part of town. And if I didn't act right, they would send my ass back to my white neighborhood. Right? They had no problem with that. And I think that was the difference, is they really had the power. Sometimes in those housekeeper or nanny relationships, or people working as domestics in your home, historically, the ultimate power really didn't always lie with that housekeeper or with that nanny. They had a lot more power than we sometimes give them credit for or recognize. But at the end of the day, they were still employees. Right, and in a sense, that was different for me. So it was much more like I really was subordinated to black authority, which I think was a beautiful and really helpful thing.
What is it that idea that I'm not racist or bigoted because I have people in my life that I work with that are even family members that are black people, and I love them. Right. And I treat everybody the same. How do you understand your own bigotry and racism, given the fact that you have lots of people of color or of different ethnicities in your life, through work, through church, through even your family, and you have great relationships with them and they like you and you treat them well, so you can't be a racist, or you don't have those tendencies because of your own relationships? What is that? Name it and explain it.
Well, I think where that comes from, of course, is our tendency to individualize the notion of racism, so that racism is what bad, horrible racists do. It's what bad people do, right? And so if I think of racism as this individual affliction, naturally, I'm going to try to, draw that circle in a way that I'm outside of it. But the analogy I use is think about it with regard to sex and gender. I mean, would anyone take it seriously if a man were to say, well, I can't be sexist, I'm married to a woman? Like, what kind of stupid argument would that be, right? Or like, I date women, I sleep with women, I love women. Like, who in the world would think that being a heterosexual man means you can't be sexist just because you are intimately connected to women? I don't think there are very many straight women who would buy that argument, right? So obviously I can have very close relationships, much closer than just hanging out at the water cooler at work or going to the, Buffalo Wild Wings with my black colleague and watching a game. I mean, I can actually, have an intimate sexual relationship with a spouse for 30 years who's female and still have views about women as a group that are less than open-minded, let's just say, right? And so I think if we stop obsessing about what it means that, we internalize some racist beliefs because we grew up in a culture that inculcated those in all of us. If we let go of the shame around that and realize, of course we did. It's like saying that I'm an air breather. Yes, I am. Now what, right? Of course we've internalized that stuff. Then I think we'd be in a much better place. But we're so obsessed with saying we're not racist and saying about all the black friends we have and all the black colleagues that we love and all the black musical artists who we respect and whomever else, that we're missing the bigger point, which is, like I said, I grew up in Nashville, had for a while I had nothing but black friends. I mean, that was really my entire friendship circle. But you know what? That didn't protect them from mistreatment by teachers, and it didn't prevent them from being tracked into the remedial level classes. And it didn't and I wasn't with them as we went through life when they started driving and had to worry about cops pulling them over on some bullshit. And I wasn't with them when they went to the bank to get their first home loan. So the fact that I'm a friend of theirs or that we were close and that I care deeply for them doesn't protect them from racism. And it doesn't mean that I'm not implicated in that larger social system that we share.
What is, if anything, wrong with two white guys talking about racism and without people of color in the conversation? You have been, people would say this about you. You're an anti-racist speaker, an educator. You go into all kinds of different organizations and help educate them on understanding their biases and history and so on. But often, you hear that from folks. Well, I'm done listening to white people talking about race. You have a great answer for that. I know. What is it?
Sure. Well, there's nothing wrong with white people talking about race and racism. I think it also makes perfect sense for people of color in particular to not obsess over what we're saying about it. I mean, people of color, black and brown folks, don't have a lot that they can learn from us about this thing. Quite the opposite. We have a lot to learn from them. But I think that most black and brown folks also realize there's certainly value in white folks challenging one another. So, of course, most of the places that I go and the institutions where I speak and the people to whom I speak tend to be mostly white audiences. And all I'm doing when I do that work, or all I'm trying to do, is what black folks in the civil rights movement, particularly in the later years of that movement and during the rise of black power, told white folks to do, which was to speak to our people and to challenge other white folks. So most of my audiences, that's who the audiences are going to principally be, because white folks can challenge other white folks just like men can challenge other men around sexism, sometimes more effectively than women can, precisely because of sexism, men are not listening to women. Precisely because of racism, white folks will oftentimes not listen to people of color. Now that has to change. We have to get to a place where that isn't true. But I think for some white folks, other white folks, whether it's me, it could be you, it could be any other white person who's willing to step into that space, can serve as a bit of a gateway drug to that deeper analysis, right? There are a lot of brilliant scholars, thinkers, writers, artists of color who do work on these issues. And if I can get someone thinking about these issues and then steer them toward that work, steer them toward the work of those activists, those people of color-led organizations, those scholars of color, then I feel like I'm helping to open up a world of analysis for them and a world of thought for them that can be helpful. But I certainly get why people of color are like, I'm not listening to white folks anymore. Of course, I don't blame you. We're not trying to educate black and brown folks about something they live every day. That's for sure.
So why is this such a difficult conversation, Tim, to have, the conversation about racism in America? I mean, you don't find it particularly difficult, I don't think, because you're so educated on it. You speak on it. I don't find it particularly difficult because my approach is one of curiosity. Like I want to learn about it in every facet, from the history to the psychology to economics. But why is it so difficult for our country, our media, and each other to have a conversation about the racial divisions that we live with every day?
Because I think to acknowledge the depths of this problem is to cast doubt upon the dominant cultural narrative of our entire society, which is the idea that wherever people end up is all about their own effort, right? This idea of meritocracy and rugged individualism, which are really, that's like Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism, right? That's like the foundational secular gospel. So if that is the foundational secular gospel, to acknowledge that there are these institutional inequities that skew the distribution of stuff, that get in the way of meritocracy and rugged individualism actually working as advertised, then that really challenges my whole worldview. It's like being in a church and having someone point out something in the scripture that actually calls into question the entire narrative. And all of a sudden you're sitting there like, holy hell, my whole worldview is now sort of teetering on the brink. And people don't like, particularly if they get older and they're sort of set in their thinking, which we all get to be after a while, we don't like to have our worldview challenged. It's one thing if I challenge your perspective on, I don't know, like agricultural subsidies, right? Like that's probably not going to rock your world because your overall worldview is not contingent upon whether you support agricultural subsidies for family farms or not, right? But if I say to you, oh, the whole concept of America as this place of individual meritocracy is sort of a lie, and here's the evidence, well, you can imagine that can be incredibly hard to swallow in a country that has lied to itself for hundreds of years about its origins. We've lied. I mean, our conflicts right now around immigration are principally because we have lied. Those of us called white have lied about how we got here and why we came. I mean, when Donald Trump can say, as he does, Mexico's not sending its best, and it's like, dude, do you think England sent their best? Like, what the hell are you talking about, right? Like have you read Dickens? And of course, no, Trump has not read Dickens, but most people have, right? If they get to that age. And England didn't send their best. Ireland didn't send their best. Russia didn't send their best. We were the losers of Europe. But if you think that but we all get on Ancestry looking for friggin' kings and queens and dukes and connections to royalty. We're not looking for peasants, right? When we're hitting those Ancestry leaves that keep spinning around, we're not sitting there going, oh, I hope I get a union organizer. Like, that's not what we're. That's not.
Well, they did.
Right?
I mean, England did send David Beckham and Hugh Grant and.
Right. I mean, maybe some of us are looking for that, but we're not sitting there thinking like, God, I hope I get the peasant that burned down the master's manor. Right. We're looking to see like, oh, good, I'm related to Henry VIII. Right. I don't know why you'd want to be, but that's what we're looking for. And so I think we've told these myths about our own origin. And if we just realize, look, we were the losers of Europe who could not make it and had to start over. And that is beautiful. There's something truly beautiful about that. But it's also beautiful when you're coming from Honduras with the same story, and El Salvador with the same story, and Sri Lanka with the same story, et cetera.
But not if you're bringing all of your food and your music and your culture.
Right. If you bring all right, and you're going to mess up our good stuff here. Right. I mean, but that's just it. Right. If you tell a lie to yourself for that long about who you are and why you came, then you'll always feel threatened by the other. And I think if you understood, like, no, actually, they're coming for the same reason we came, you could see yourself in them, and this wouldn't be such an issue. But we've lied to ourselves for hundreds of years, and I think it makes it very difficult. The lie
seems to be what I'm hearing you say. Is it institutional meritocracy? Is that what you said?
Well, just the notion of the myth of meritocracy and rugged individualism.
So what I'm hearing you're saying is that this idea that there's a whole bunch of folks in this country from all backgrounds who have worked really hard and had tremendous success in their lives, and who have had setback after setback, but somehow overcame their obstacles and their challenges. But what it sounds like you're saying is that story, that narrative, whatever it might be, is just an anecdote. If you look at it from a systemic situation, certain people have a far greater advantage in terms of getting ahead in any way, however you measure success, from education to jobs, et cetera. Right. But that system does not apply to certain other people. So we look at it and say, I did it, so can you. Or if you're a person of color, Barack Obama did it, Michelle Obama did it, Michael Jordan did it, why can't you? What you're trying to explain is, no, the system is purposely been created to advantage certain groups of people and make it far, far more difficult for other people. We have so much data on that, but people just think America's a land of opportunity. You can make it here. This is the place to be.
But here's the thing, right? We always said that. We said that even during the days of segregation, when it obviously wasn't even true in theory. That myth of meritocracy and upward mobility and rugged individualism, it's not like that's only been around for like 40 years. That was a myth that was common in the 40s, in the 20s, in the 1890s. That's something that people have been saying in this country since its founding, even when women couldn't vote, when people of color had no rights to speak of, when indigenous people were still being hunted off the land that they had lived in for generations, when children were still working in factories and mines. I mean, give me a break, right? So we know that it wasn't true for most of our history, and yet we still said it. So the question for me has always been not, can individuals sometimes overcome obstacles? Of course they can. But the first African-American millionaire in this country was Madam C.J. Walker, who was, the woman who came up with this, cosmetics empire for Black women, because most of the beauty industry at that time, of course, was certainly not going to be focused on women of color. So she becomes a millionaire, but she became a millionaire in 1911, which I think we can all agree on balance was a pretty bad year to be Black in the United States of America. Like, it was not a time where you could just say, well, Madam C.J. Walker made it. What the hell's wrong with your Black ass, right? Like, obviously, most Black folks were not going to have that experience. There have always been individuals who've overcome obstacles in every society, no matter how oppressive, but you cannot extrapolate from that to a larger social truth. The larger social truth is that right now we have about a half a dozen people in this country, all of them with the last name Walton, who own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 40% of the American population. Now, if you actually believe that these 6 people in the Walmart Walton family, one of whom just married into the family, so, that's a whole different issue, but 6 people named Walton who have worked collectively harder than the bottom, 100 and I don't know what that is, 130 million, 140, 150 million Americans. I don't know what the hell I can do for you at that point if you believe that. Clearly, we have a system that is predicated on the domination of the few at the expense of the many. And that doesn't just work against the interest of people of color. It works against the vast majority of white Americans as well, who are not in that top 1%, top 1/10 of 1%. And so this myth of meritocracy, the dangerous thing about it, man, is if you're told all of your life that wherever you end up is all about you, what happens? Let's even take it out of the race conversation. What happens to a white guy who's been told that all his life? And for the most part, right, you look around, you do see white men sort of on top of most of the structures in society, and you're told, well, that's because they're the best, and if you work hard, you'll be there too. And then what happens if you're 50 and you get a pink slip from your boss, right? And all of a sudden you've been told and now you don't have health care, and you don't have enough saved for retirement, and so now what do? Well, this society encourages you to blame yourself rather than saying, you know what, there are these weird impersonal forces. Put aside racism for a second, put aside sexism. There's just this global economy that makes people expendable, right? So is that on you? Is it your fault that you're coming up in an age where the company can send the jobs to Sri Lanka and take advantage of, lower wages or whatever, and the boss can, decide to spend all the profits on stock buybacks rather than investing in raises and plant and equipment for the job? No, it's not your fault, but this society makes you doubt your own sanity, makes you question whether you've done something wrong, rather than saying, wait a minute, we've got like a casino economy that doesn't work for anyone. So it's really a dagger pointed at the heart of all working people, not just people of color, but white folks as well. And so we continue to adhere to this thinking at our own peril, I think, all of us.
So well said, and for so many reasons. I guess where I want to pick up is making it personal. As a guy who's had a tremendous amount of success, losing my job at a corporate media company that providing me with salary, a 401k, and a great health insurance benefits. So when I lost the health care, you go through, I lost a job. You go through a cycle of blaming yourself, thinking you weren't good enough. You then you name that, and that's ego, and you realize, oh my God, you look at it completely different in a healthy way. But you can't stop dealing with the reality. In my case, at healthcare policy, our policy will be like $2,500 a month, and you sit there and you can't help but be angry that we live in a system that if you lose your job, even if you're someone like myself, you are now going to be hit with this healthcare bill that is going to be your almost single-minded focus for you, and in my case, my wife. How do we figure that out every month? And then you look at the inequities in the country and who has that health care and who doesn't. It's not about how hard you worked. It's not about what opportunity you have. That's what I'm trying to make it personal about someone who's had a lot of success, that I should still have health care for my daughters. It's not their fault that I lost my gig.
Right. And that's just it, though. We live in a culture. And I mean, and for me, I have this experience as someone who's, been sort of on my own independently, professionally for 25 years, as a writer and a lecturer and all that. And so it's very boom or bust. You have these cycles where, you have a lot of work. And then there are times when it's like, yeah, we've heard your shit before. We're not going to bring you back to speak. Okay, fine, whatever. And so you have you have some years where you make a lot more money than other years. And when there's a dip, you notice it. And this is a culture that, and I don't want to, I'm not going to complain too much. I mean, we live well and we're fine, right? But there are certainly those psychological moments where, because of the society in which we live, when your professional situation takes any kind of a hit, you are encouraged at some level in this society to blame yourself. You really are. You're not, even the idea of saying, oh, that's just sort of shitty luck, right? We don't even believe in luck in this country, right? We don't even believe that things sometimes just happen. everybody wants to say, well, everything happens for a reason. See, I don't buy that bullshit, because if that's true, then that means those, 3.5 billion kids on this planet, or 3.5 billion people that are living on less than $1 a day, that's somehow for a reason? Bullshit. That's not for a reason. That's not fate. There's something else. There's something really horribly random about life, but we don't want to admit that, because if I admit that there's such a thing as luck, rather than saying the really nice new agey thing, oh, I believe we make our own luck, whatever. But if I admit that there's such a thing as luck, then I realize, holy shit, my luck could go bad next week. And I don't want to admit that, because I want to say I am the captain of my own ship. And by God, I can steer this ship through any, icebergs. But here's the thing. If we lived in a society that didn't place the onus for our outcomes on us as individuals, if we lived in a society that believed in the collective and believed in the communal and believed, it's all of us or none of us, then we wouldn't have that sort of constant voice in the back of our head saying, you're not good enough, you're letting your children down, right? Yes. Like that's the result of a collective psychosis that we have indulged for far too long.
So when you look at the economic systems in other countries, the democracies in other countries, the issues that other nations and societies have now in 2019, much less throughout history, Tim, do you see an economic system that is far more equitable, that could be applied to the type of economy that we're in now, given the issue of a global economy, of trade the way it is, and of course in terms of automation and technology replacing people? Right. Do you hear political candidates, people running for president, from Bernie Sanders to congresswomen like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, much less academics or economists in this nation or anywhere else, and see a system that would be far better, or is it just something that we have to have a massive conversation about because we are now in the technological era?
Well, all of that, I think what you just said is true. I mean, I think number one, all of the other Western industrial democracies do social support systems and safety net networks far better than we do. So, you could take your pick literally of just about any of them, and they'd all be better to adopt their way of dealing with everything from education to healthcare to income support, nutrition support, housing support, all of it. Some better than others. Now, here's the challenge, though, right? It's one thing to say that, for instance, I philosophically support single payer 100%. I think it is absurd that we should have healthcare as a commodity. I think it's absurd to believe that the ability, right, to have private insurance, to have healthcare as a commodity that one can either get or not in the so-called marketplace, just like food or shelter, seems to me ridiculous. And I wrote about all three of those in my book, Under the Affluence, that I think those ought to be things that are taken out of the market system and decommodified, if you will, and looked at as universal human rights. Having said that, right, that is a philosophical assumption. I do not claim to have the expertise to know how to actually graft that onto a system that is so entrenched as ours. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying we do need to be realistic about it isn't going to be easy. It's not like we're sitting in a college dorm room trying to create from the ground up like a perfect utopian society at 2 a.m. after we've been doing bong hits or something, right? Like we actually are trying to figure out how do we take a system that is so entrenched with, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or maybe a couple million people that are currently employed in the private insurance industry and who rely on that system. How do we move to a different one? Now, I think we have to try. I think we absolutely morally have to try, but we also have to recognize that this is not going to be something that happens just because Bernie Sanders or whomever says that it ought to. These are things, however, that we must be talking about, because I think the American people are starting to come to the realization, at least in larger numbers than any other time in my life, that there are certain things that just shouldn't be up for grabs in the market. It's one thing to say, well, I've got the iPhone, the newest iPhone, and you've got 2 models ago, or I've got a big screen TV and you don't. All right, those are not necessities. Those are luxuries, whatever, right? But we're talking about things that are needed for human survival, and I think we could learn a lot from just about every other nation on the face of the earth that calls itself advanced or calls itself a democracy, because we're lagging behind all of them. Now, the danger, or the thing we have to be particularly cognizant of, look, the reason that we don't have that now, we got to be honest about this. The reason, and this is what sometimes I think single payer advocates and others who support larger social safety net systems, as I do, don't often acknowledge, or sometimes don't. The reason we don't have that stuff right now comes back to this issue of race that we started with on the show. Because if you look at the research on this, there is actual polling data that shows the single most highly correlated reason, the one with the highest correlation between this particular belief and opposition to universal health care is the belief on the part of white Americans that Black people will abuse the program, right? So literally, that is the single most highly correlated factor with opposition to single payer or universal care. So we've got to recognize some of these other countries that do it better than we do it. One of the reasons they can is because they aren't having to overcome the constant racism that says, yeah, but I don't want those people getting the benefit. That's one of the reasons in England right now you're starting to see, questions about the NHS. The NHS that is sort of been the crown jewel of the British, welfare system, right? And it's something that even when Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister, they weren't talking about getting rid of NHS. They were talking about streamlining it or cost savings or whatever. But nobody was talking about getting rid of it. Now you actually will hear people, in England that will talk about, oh no, we should get rid of this. Well, why is there rising opposition to things like national health care and other social safety net programs throughout Western Europe? It's because you're having influxes of whom? You're having an influx of North African folks, people from the so-called Middle East, people of color, brown folks who don't look like you. And so now there's this frugality that is really about race and ethnicity. And if we don't address that in this country and address the fact that there are people who will literally go without their own health care just to keep other people from having it. Jonathan Metzl talks about this in his book, Dying of Whiteness, that, he talked to a guy, 42-year-old guy, I think it was cirrhosis of the liver, white guy, living in subsidized housing outside of Nashville, Tennessee, no health care. And Metzl, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, says, why don't you just get on Obamacare? You can get on it. I mean, yeah, Tennessee didn't expand Medicaid. It's not as good as some places, but you can get on Obamacare right now. And this guy says, I would rather die than get on that program because I don't want my tax dollars. Keep in mind, he's poor. He doesn't pay any. He's living in subsidized housing. He says, I don't want my tax dollars going to welfare cheats and illegal immigrants. So that dude says, I'd rather die than be on a program that gets abused by those people. Guess what? That guy is now dead. Like, he literally went without and died rather than get the care that he could have gotten. So we got to be really clear. We need those kind of programs, but this thing called race gets in the way of our ability to do that. If we don't challenge that thinking, we're never going to get where we need to get on something like healthcare.
Let's talk about education. You mentioned this phrase, the myth of meritocracy. I love that phrase. And you also mentioned earlier in the beginning of our conversation about your preschool experience. I, too, went to preschool. There's a lot of data. It's very sound, I think, according to all the educators that I've talked to, that the most important thing or opportunity a person can have that will determine their success in life, however you measure success, but in terms of a career, a job, the best opportunity is if you go to preschool. Universal pre-K is something that other Western civilized nations always offer because the data says that it will create better outcomes. The data even says in those zip codes where people are less likely to have it, they turn out with a lot less opportunity at age 18. It's really, really interesting data. But how does that apply to race in America in terms of education? Talk to me, Tim, about some of the disadvantages or lack of opportunity that Black and brown folks in this country have always had when it comes to education. And I suppose you could start anywhere you wanted, but, I'm certainly looking at even today.
Well, it's certainly the case that, historically, look, education in this country was set up for a very narrow band of people, not even all white folks, let alone people of color, right? I mean, Thomas Jefferson famously said in Notes on the State of Virginia that what we needed in the United States was about 6 years of compulsory education for everyone. Of course, he only meant white people and probably only white men. 6 years of compulsory education so that we could, these are his words, words, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish, right? So the whole point of education was basically, we're going to give y'all 6 years. That'll help us figure out who the really bright people are, and the rest of y'all can work for us. So the whole point of education was always hierarchy. It was always inequality. And that was even just when white folks were in the equation. Then when you add to that the entry of black folks and other folks of color into public education in the wake of the Civil War era and certainly into the 20th century, now you then see that hierarchy being replicated on the basis of race. And so the idea was we didn't want to provide equal education, if any education, to black and brown folks, because the whole point was black and brown folks' job was to work for white people, to add value to our lives. And the notion was, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton? If they all learn to read, who's going to clean my dishes? If they all learn to read or go to school, who's going to work as a sharecropper, or who's going to wash my clothes in my house as a domestic worker, right? So obviously for generations, right, it was kept very deliberately unequal. Now, there are people who would say, well, yeah, but that changed. Well, but did it really change? Because what we did is we integrated, we had deseg after 1954, but really in most places where it was ordered, it didn't really happen for 20 years. Like I said earlier, I started school in the early 1970s in Nashville. And really when I started first grade in 1974, the public schools of Nashville had only been integrated in any real sense for a couple of years after busing was ordered. And of course, it was mightily resisted here and a lot of other places. But even then, it wasn't equitable, because what was happening was you integrated the buildings and you integrated the desks. And so we're all sitting in the same room theoretically. But then what they would do, as I said earlier, is they would separate us by so-called ability. Now, you're 5 or 6 years old. How the hell do you know what a kid is capable of at 5 or 6? Well, the answer is you don't, but you think you do. And you think you do based on where that kid's coming from, what zip code, what family, maybe their speech patterns, maybe, various things that you take as evidence of genius versus whatever the opposite of that is. And all of that is class bound and race bound. And in our case, we had a lot of teachers who had never taught black kids before and didn't really have any interest in doing it. And I remember in first grade, my mom, who has no teacher certification whatsoever, was the first grade teacher would ask my mother to come to the school and work with the black kids, because she the teacher didn't know what the hell she was doing with them. And my mom would come and do the best she could, but she didn't even have a certification, right? So it is, from the very beginning, integration was just about physical space. It wasn't really about true equity. It wasn't really about integrating the philosophies of schooling, because if you think about it, under segregation, black schools were places of real intellectual ferment, because that community knew they had to rise or fall together, right? And so the teachers lived in the neighborhood, the administrators lived in the neighborhood. It was all or nothing. It was about collective liberation, not to romanticize the days of segregation, but that was like a residual benefit of it, was you had this sort of collective struggle mentality. You integrate the bodies, but they fired half the black teachers. They fired half the black principals because they didn't need them anymore, quote unquote. And then they just threw all these black kids into a system that was really about white dominance and white leadership. And we're like, sink or swim, and we're not going to attend to your needs. That's what we still are doing. And then at the end of 12 years, we give all of these kids these standardized tests to determine, we've been giving them to them since kindergarten, really, but then we give them a whole new round of them to determine whether they're going to go to college, and if so, which college. And when you take unstandardized kids from unstandardized neighborhoods, unstandardized family backgrounds with unstandardized economic resources, unstandardized teacher quality in their K-12 schools, and then you give them a standardized exam that's going to determine the next level of their life, like a gatekeeping mechanism, and you call that fairness, you're obviously not paying attention to the inherent unfairness of that. So everything we do, whether it's the funding, whether it's the zoning, whether it's the curriculum design, whether it's the disciplinary inequalities, all of it is clearly very much so still about maintaining certain types of hierarchy, whether we acknowledge that openly or not.
Leaving racial disadvantages out of it, just standardized tests in general. I have so many thoughts, and I've read so much research about it, but my main thought is, of course, it leaves out all kinds of people, but it left me out They left me out very badly. I hated taking tests. I wasn't good at taking tests. They gave me great anxiety. I don't have the type of memory intelligence that studying, helps me retain this knowledge so that I can go then apply it on this standardized test. But those tests didn't measure grit and charisma and personality and sense of humor and personal confidence and desires. They couldn't measure that in me, and because they couldn't measure that in me, I landed in I couldn't get into a good school. And I don't even know if I would have done well in a good school, because maybe I'm not typical to educational standards in terms of how I learn. But the point is, these tests in general let so many amazing young people fall through the cracks and think that they're not as good.
Right. And that's a great point, because, normally when people like myself who do anti-racism work criticize standardized tests, there are those people who push back and think we're just trying to quote unquote lower standards for kids of color. And that's not true at all. I'm just saying these standards are not good measures of human ability. They're not legitimate measures for anyone. It's not about lowering them. It's about saying, why are these the standards? And I'm like you, Pete. I was someone who, I was a really pretty shitty student until like last Wednesday. Okay. I just got my shit together like last week, and I'm 51 years old. So, late bloomer, but I was a terrible student. I always, but the teachers always thought I was really capable, because I was really like I was very articulate, very, verbally capable of engaging adults in conversation, right? Which is a skill set, to be sure. But in my case, that was a skill set that I possessed because my dad was an actor and a stand-up comic. So I was in a very verbal household. Okay. I was in a household where I was constantly, as a kid, trying to figure out how to interject at the dinner table with a dad who was constantly making jokes and he was always on, right? And so you do learn like verbal abilities and oral presentation skills in those early years that way, but you don't learn how to diagram a sentence, and you don't learn how to do algebra, and you don't, that kind of stuff was not of interest to me. So when I would take these standardized tests, I got an SAT score so bad that if I were to try, I went to Tulane, which was a good school then and is a really good school now. I could not bribe my way into Tulane now. Like, there's no way. The standards have gotten so much harder. And I remember when I took the SAT, and my guidance counselor in high school said, well, you're going to go to Tulane. You're never going to make it there. You're going to be like a C student there. She said, there's just no way. You shouldn't go there. You need to go somewhere, in state or whatever. And I went. And here's the thing now. And this is what the SAT actually does. The SAT only predicts, even by the evidence that the SAT folks themselves use, it really only can predict the first semester of your freshman year, how you're likely to do. It predicts the next semester of school, basically after you take the test as a senior or whatever. And in my case, you know what? She was right. I did have a C average after my first semester. But then once I was able to focus in my major on the stuff that I really enjoyed, on the stuff that I was really interested in, then I started getting A's and pulled it together. So, but the SAT doesn't test that. The SAT doesn't test what you're interested in. It tests what they think you ought to know, even if you're not going to study that stuff. And so I ended up, like a lot of people, I think, doing badly on the test, but ended up being a decent college student. I wasn't like, National Honor Society or whatever. I wasn't cum laude or whatever, but I did fine. I ended up with like a high B average, even though I had a terrible SAT score. What does that tell you? It wasn't measuring the stuff that really matters. And what it really doesn't measure, it doesn't measure human decency. I'm quite confident, the Unabomber was a certified genius, right? Ted Bundy was well above average. The guys that invented napalm all would have had high SAT scores. I'm fairly sure that Goebbels would have done well on the MCAT. Like, what does that have to do with your actual decency as a human being, the kind of person that you are? It doesn't tell us anything about that. And we don't want our colleges and universities or our workplaces to just be filled with people who are like basically fresh off the Mensa meeting. It's like hanging out with people that are all good at sort of abstract, standardized testing skills is incredibly boring. We need universities, colleges. It really, I'm not just saying that because I can't.
Yeah, you need musicians.
I'm not just saying it because I can't get into Mensa. Yes, it's true, right?
You need all types of people. I couldn't agree more. My story is very, very similar to yours, it sounds like, in many ways. But if instead in high school they tested my my grit in terms of physically. I wasn't the most talented athlete, but no one worked harder than me. If the test was how many sprints will you run up this steep hill, I would have won. I would have ran the most sprints, maybe not the fastest, but I would have done the most work. If the test then said, when you get done with the sprints, give a speech or do a 3-minute comedy act, again, I would have been the best at that. But I didn't care about numbers and letters being next to each other. I had no interest in algebra. During algebra, I was drawing. I'm a very good artist. That's what I did during algebra because I had no interest. And when I took the SAT, I had to take a shit the whole time because the night before I had a burrito. And it's funny, but it's true. The whole time I was taking the test, I was, number one, I suck at this. And number two, I'm going to shit my pants. I'm going to be forever known as the kid who shit his pants during the SAT. Luckily, I was taking it in a high school that wasn't mine. But the idea that was a concern for me that was going to dictate and determine my future is huge. And everything that you said, a huge problem with our system that folks don't talk about very much.
Right. Well, and the problem is that kids get the idea from an early age that they either sort of have aptitude or they don't, which is another huge myth that, you know, and so like I remember for me coming to the conclusion, it wasn't just that I wasn't good at math. I thought that there was something defective about me. It wasn't, yes, I wasn't interested, but saying that I wasn't interested in math was sort of my way of protecting myself psychologically from my incompetence too, right? It was a way of saying like, I don't have to care about this because I suck at it. But here's the thing, and I don't know about you, in the earliest years of my schooling, I loved math. Like when I was in 3rd grade, 4th grade, I thought math was the shit. I thought it was really cool because I liked the puzzle aspect of it. But most people who are like that, who end up hating math, there is a common story and we all have it. And it is about having a really horrible math teacher in 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, whenever it was, at that very important time where you're just like, screw this. And the problem is, if you have been led to believe that you have aptitude, maybe you were good at math as a kid and you thought, and your parents thought they were doing you a favor by saying, you're so smart, you're so good at math. And then when all of a sudden you're not, you go the opposite direction. You think, I'm bad at math. And then you turn off to it. But the truth is, this whole myth of aptitude, which gets in the way of all of us, and then you layer onto that class and gender and race stereotypes and everything else, this whole myth of aptitude causes us to disengage and to internalize our failure. Again, going back to that myth of meritocracy idea, this idea that, well, if I'm not good at something, then I just must not be good at it, rather than focusing on what you said, which is whether we call it grit or perseverance or determination, we ought to be measuring how hard are you trying to do something? Because if I start out with and I think of this in terms of race and class in particular, if I start out with a 5-lap head start on you in an 8-lap race, well, just basic logic says I'm supposed to hit the tape first. No kidding, right? I'm supposed to win the race. But if someone who started out 5 laps behind me ends up only 3 laps behind me, by definition, they're the faster runner. And if I'm picking a track team, that's the guy or the woman that I want, right? The one who closed the gap because they worked harder than me, who just sort of did the tortoise and the hare thing. You know, I did the hare, right? I'm just like, screw it. I don't have to run fast, You know, so, and unfortunately, we do society as a winner take all. So we give the person with the 5-lap head start the trophy, even though they had the 5-lap head start. It's like we do the opposite of the NFL draft, right? Like the NFL draft, at least the NFL, for all of its flaws, and they are prodigious, knows that like you got to give the shittiest team the 1st round draft pick to try to balance things out, you know? But we do society the opposite. It's like we just give the Patriots the 1st round pick every year, basically, or whoever won the Super Bowl last year. It's like, here, why don't you just pick the next best player and get the next best player and the next best player? And you just keep adding to your advantage rather than saying, wait a minute. Maybe we need to figure out a way to create greater balance. And that, of course, means rethinking this whole rugged individualism notion.
Made me feel so good just in terms of saying that there's data to something that was actually applicable in my life. I did like math up until 7th grade. Then in 8th grade, I had a teacher I didn't like very much. And it was as math was getting harder. In 9th grade, math got really hard for me. And my teacher was old and uninterested and constantly smoking and drinking coffee. And it was was a bad experience. Then in 10th grade, my teacher recognized my aptitudes, my talents. He really liked me as a person. and maybe geometry was easier, but he made it enjoyable. Oh, and I forgot my ninth grade summer school because of my ninth grade terrible teacher. I would say mostly because of him and his lack of interest in me and his inability to really teach the way I learned, at least. I had to go to summer school, spent my summer in summer school, and this woman taught me differently, and I got an 89 on the state test. I totally understood it. It all computed for me, and so that makes a tremendous amount of sense in my own life. But getting back to, I got to wrap up, I know, with you, but I mean, I wanted to just, getting back to, we didn't talk at all. I didn't mention the president's name. Didn't mention it on purpose. I didn't want to. I want to talk about all these other things. I'm so glad I didn't. And I also didn't mention it because I was watching one of your talks to get ready to talk to you, and you talked about how racial inequities have existed in this country long before Donald Trump was elected. Sure. And it's been here since the start of our country and for generations. And then I thought, most of my conversations with Tim, which I will call an ongoing conversation that I've had with you over the years on TV and radio, were always before Donald Trump became the president. And so I don't want to talk with you today about him. I do want to the next time. But I just wanted to talk just a little bit about the fact that we've always had this unequal system in terms of both racial and gender equity, and it's only now come to, I don't know, how would you describe the flashpoint that we're now at, and what was the groundwork that was laid to create the situation? Maybe you don't even believe that was the case.
Well, no, look, Donald Trump is a symptom of that system. The reason that Donald Trump can become president in the first place on a platform that basically is telling working class and middle class white folks that their enemies are black and brown, which is the oldest play in the American playbook, going back to the colonies, rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. The only reason he can do that is because it's such a persistent underlying trope in American politics. It's literally as if he opened up the playbook of American politics, and on page 1, because we know he doesn't like to read, he was like, holy shit, I'll use this play, and then he's closed the book and was like, I'm going to go with that one because it works. And it has worked for hundreds of years to divide people from one another and keep us from really solving our problems. So to think of Donald Trump as the cause of the problem is to invert cause and effect. He is a perfect exemplar of what white privilege is. First of all, someone who, in spite of, receiving over the course of his life, even beginning in childhood and over the period of 70 plus years, $400 million plus, according to that New York Times investigative story, from either dollars or property from his dad, was a millionaire by the time he was 8, was earning quote unquote $200,000 a year by the time he was 3, and yet still is able to position himself as a self-made billionaire and a business genius. And people will buy that in a way that they would never if a person of color were to try to tell that story. So he's a symptom. And I think what we have to remember is that it is very important, I think, for those of us who consider ourselves progressive or care about justice, obviously, to remove this man in one way or another from the presidency, whether it's at the ballot box or impeachment or whatever it is. But the thing is, the larger question for me is, how do we defeat Trumpism? And I'm almost hesitant to even call it Trumpism because obviously it predates Trump. But when David Duke was running, I called it Dukeism, whatever. But it's this notion, it's this politics of prejudice that is rooted in divide and conquer. How do we stop this pitting of working class people against one another, which folks like Trump have done for so long? Because if the Democrats manage to defeat him, let's say at the ballot box in November of 2020 by, 6 electoral votes, 10 electoral votes, 20 electoral votes, I'll take it, whatever, right? But the thing is, if Trumpism lives to fight another day, because it's not discredited, it's not dealt a real blow and put on the mat like a boxer in a boxing match, then my concern is, Donald Trump may be gone, but you got these right-wing organizations out there like Turning Point USA and others that are manufacturing little Trump clones clones who aren't as ignorant and stupid and self-interested and venal as Donald Trump. There are smarter versions of Donald Trump out there, and I'm worried about them. I'm worried about what comes next. So we have to figure out a way to discredit the larger politics of prejudice, and the only way we do that is to take aim at the institutional inequities which are pitting us against one another, causing us to be suspicious of one another, causing white folks to worry about every person of color that seems to be quote unquote gaining on us, worried about everybody coming from a non-white country. Oh my God, they're taking our stuff, as opposed to figuring out how we're going to work together to make this society and this country and this idea of America work better for everyone. And to me, that's the struggle we've been in for a couple of hundred years or more as a country, but even going back to the colonial period, trying to figure out for 400 years now, not able to figure it out. And so we cannot afford to think that Donald Trump is the reason we're in this condition. This idea that if we get rid of him, we go back to normal. Normal was never good. Normal was, economically, black folks twice as likely as whites to be unemployed. Well, guess what? That's still the same. Latinx folks 50% more likely to be unemployed than white folks. It's still the same. White folks with 12 to 15 times the net worth of black folks on average. Well, that was the case before Trump. It's the case now. Like, normal was never acceptable. We have to move forward, not back. And I think sometimes the Democrats and for their own reasons, Democrats and Republicans engage in a certain kind of nostalgia, right? The conservatives with their MAGA hats, obviously that's this wistful nostalgia for days gone by, which is retrograde. And I think it's obvious for most listeners probably why that is. But even the Democrats engage in this sort of Obama nostalgia. Like, if we can just go back to the Obama years. Well, the Obama years were a stepping stone. That was not the sum total of what justice looks like, for God's sake. And if we're going to continue to talk about going backwards, I just don't think you can fight nostalgia with nostalgia. Young people want to move forward, and we've got to figure out a way to do that.
So glad I asked that question. What is so much there to continue talking about, and I hope that we can continue talking here on this podcast. You have 58 episodes of your podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise, which is awesome. And here at the end, I just wanted to give you the opportunity. I'm doing this podcast now. Hopefully you can steal as many listeners of mine that will check you out. If you enjoyed my conversation, then check out Tim's talks and speeches on YouTube. But of course, subscribe to his podcast, his Patreon as well. What is a typical episode? Is there a typical episode? That's a dumb question.
Yeah, well, there isn't. I mean, I would say out of those 58, the vast majority of them obviously involve conversations with guests, both activists, scholars, artists, filmmakers, all kinds of different folks talking about race-related topics. Sometimes I don't have guests, and I'll just sort of riff on the day's events and do 45 minutes to an hour on that.
People who I would listen to do that. I think most people can't talk into a microphone alone for very long.
Right. No. Yeah. And it's. The goal is definitely to always try to have guests. I've also had a couple of panel discussions that I've recorded from conferences, which make for some really good conversations. Last 3 episodes actually were conversations with a number of folks at the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, which is an annual conference every year. This last year we did it in Portland, had some really good conversations. So there's not really a typical episode, but I definitely hope that folks will check it out. And and then of course I also post bonus commentaries on the Patreon page for people who become patrons. So that's always nice as well.
Patreon is pretty cool. I'm using it now, and at first it almost felt like, oh, this is almost pathetic that you're going out and you're asking people to subscribe. But I'm like, wait, that's exactly what I did at SiriusXM. And if they were only listening to my show and they were paying whatever it was, most of those pennies of every dollar. And it's really interesting what it's doing for creative people, educators, and activists, comedians, entertainers. I think it's very wholesome and creates a much better sense of equity. You can pay for the things and people that you like. I love it.
Right. No, I think it's absolutely great. And if we can all get to the point where we're making what Jordan Peterson makes on Patreon, we'll all be set. You won't have to worry about healthcare. You can just make Jordan Peterson money. That's for sure.
I don't want to know what that number is. Tim Wise, thank you for talking to me. It was really, I guess I wasn't expecting it to be personally inspiring to start my day by talking to you. And I always love talking to you. I learn so much, but I don't know, maybe it's the place I'm in, but hearing you talk about a number of things today really resonated with me personally. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey man, thank you. And best to you and your family.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Yep.
Wow. How about that? What a conversation. I think I probably talked too much. Who the hell cares what I have to say when Tim Wise is in a conversation? But I really love talking to that guy. That is it for today. Travel safely this week if you're in the car, and tell everybody to check this podcast out. I'm sure a lot of people will be in their cars listening to podcasts. So download, subscribe to Stand Up with Pete Dominick. And on the Patreon, you can sign up for a paid subscription. Cannot thank you enough for those of you that have patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Check it out. Sign up. Couple bucks. Really appreciate it. Come see me if you're in and around Syracuse this weekend, the 29th and 30th, the Funny Bone in Syracuse, and a lot more dates on my Facebook and website, Stand Up with Pete Dominick. Okay, have a good Monday. I will talk to you on Wednesday right here on the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast. As always, be the change that you want to see in the world.